Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on countering terrorist propaganda. This is a somewhat well-explored topic, but I think it's especially topical right now given the state of ISIS and returning foreign fighters, as well as continued and ongoing efforts to recruit new foreign fighters to the cause, and this is occurring throughout the globe. So since this is such a well-explored topic, I'd like to narrow the scope of our discussion. We're going to focus less on efforts to de-radicalize violent extremists, and instead, we're going to focus on how terrorists create and use narratives through modern communication propaganda. However, in order to better understand the efficacy of propaganda, I think it's first useful to explore its history, as well as to take a closer look at how groups weave and intertwine individual and collective narratives to form a more cohesive message. And then finally, we'll take a look at some of the technical ways that both governments and benevolent non-state actors can use alternative narratives to counter that propaganda. And then finally, we'll have a word of note about some of the issues that can arise out of attempts to counter terrorist propaganda. So when looking at terror groups such as the Islamic State, it's important to distinguish between local fighters, who are typically pressed into service under the threat of death, or through other push factors such as poverty and under-governance, and we compare those to foreign fighters who are typically drawn to the battlefield due to radicalization. Now, most estimates place the number of foreign terrorist fighters in Iraq and Syria at the height of ISIS's caliphate at over 70,000. This obviously means that roughly 70,000 foreign civilians identified strongly enough with the ideology of the Islamic State that they made their way to the Levant. So then the obvious question is, what compelled them to do that? So to better understand this, I think it's worthwhile to take a look at propaganda through history. Now, propaganda itself is as old as the written word, and that's going to be a common theme that we see throughout the history of propaganda, is that every time there is a new communication medium, there's a new method by which to transmit messages to the populace. So most of us are likely familiar, at least intuitively and qualitatively, with what propaganda is. However, at its base level, propaganda is information that is not impartial and used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, often by presenting facts selectively or perhaps lying by omission, in order to encourage a loaded message, which hopefully produces an emotional rather than a rational response to that information. So the term propaganda has acquired a strongly negative connotation by association, through its association with covert manipulation. Now, a byproduct of communication itself, propaganda has a prolific past which mirrors the arc of different mediums of mass communication. So during the Protestant Reformation, the printing press made possible the spread of both new ideas and thought patterns across Central and Western Europe. Many of them were benevolent in nature, but there was certainly plenty of misinformation by both sides, and the printing press allowed this to be spread at a much faster pace and much wider dissemination to the audience. Now, if you fast forward to the American Revolution, American colonists had a flourishing network of newspapers and printers throughout the Northeast, which specialized in the topic on behalf of the patriots, but occasionally outright disinformation was used, such as when Benjamin Franklin circulated false stories of atrocities committed by the Seneca Indians who were in league with the British. The World Wars call to mind the most memorable instances of state-run propaganda through both print and the media from both sides. So keeping up with technical advances, both sides came to rely on radio to widely disseminate messages meant to deter the morale and spirit of the adversary while maintaining political will at home. However, in the era of globalization, the vast interconnectedness has been both the boon to and the bane of propagandists. So there's been much academic research into how and why people radicalize. And there are a few trends that tend to emerge throughout all streams of this academic research. Grievance is typically considered a common strain that runs throughout many Muslim jihadist-based narratives, and they typically blame Western society for Muslim suffering that occurs around the world. Now, these same groups also hone in on perceived discrimination, alienation, repression of freedoms, and expression of religion. When we couple these with push factors such as poverty, inaccessibility to education and opportunities, as well as poor governance, these grievances provide a fertile breeding ground for radicalization. Underneath these exploited grievances lie a warped sense of ideology of Islam, which manipulates Muslim obligation to use violence in order to defend Muslims around the world. Following groups like Al Qaeda in Iraq and its successor, the Islamic State, these ideologies have taken on a markedly sectarian tone, specifically calling on Sunni Muslims to defend against a perceived Shia aggression. The role of ideology is particularly important because it accentuates all of the other factors in the radicalization process by becoming the vehicle that violent extremists use to act upon their grievances. The presence of an influencer is also a common factor for many who radicalize. We've already spoken at length in previous discussions about the importance of a charismatic leader to terrorist movements. Now, a narrative is a coherent system of interrelated and sequentially organized stories that share a common rhetorical desire to resolve conflict by establishing audience expectations. Narratives are compelling for many Muslims because they provide simple, prepackaged explanations of past events and contemporary conditions while incorporating ideas, texts, and interpretations from derived Islamic sources, such as the Quran. A master narrative transcends particular historical contexts and is embedded in a particular culture. Islamist master narratives assist Muslims in making sense of events by connecting them to new and existing information, justifying the actions and orienting future action towards these goals. There are 11 master narratives which originate in the sacred texts of Islam and cover a wide array of topics which are selectively used and warped by Islamist groups, the most frequent of which is the Crusader narrative to call attention to the presence of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. ISIS was especially adept at incorporating these master narratives into propaganda, such as their feature-length film Flames of War and their well-produced periodical Dabiq, which features a first-page quote from AQI founder Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in every issue. The internet made dissemination of these products nearly ubiquitous. Now, this particular graphic is from the Archetti reading from a few weeks ago, and I think it's useful because it describes the way that narratives are formed based upon each individual's lens through which they view the world. Now, radicalization does not occur in a vacuum, and it affects individuals differently. If you look simply at the numbers, the overwhelming majority of the globe's 1.6 billion Muslims have rejected ISIS's ideology, but the small percentage they do draw are susceptible to recruitment and radicalization. So that then begs the question, why are some affected, why others are not? Radicalization is predicated on a series of overlapping networks. The simplest unit of understanding for these relationships is the individual narrative, which consists of a person's understanding of the world and their role in it. An individual's identity is shaped by their peripheral relationships at any given moment. In the past, those relationships tended to be very localized, but modern communication technologies have extended the reach of face-to-face interactions for both direct and indirect relationships. But exposure to propaganda alone does not equate to radicalization. As Archetti aptly points out, the availability of jihadist content online does not necessarily equate to reach, i.e., a message being accessed and consumed. Rather, these messages are constantly viewed through the lens of the individual who is in contact with various other individuals and their collective narratives. When constantly viewed through the lens of the individual narrative, this can lead to a transformation of the vision of the world for that particular individual, which is then reflected through his or her changing patterns of social relationships. As a result, the narrative maps are constantly changing, further adding to the difficulty of countering terrorist narratives. This graphic illustrates this point. Individuals 1 and 3 obviously have separate individual narratives, but through their own constellation of relationships, they view themselves as having similar collective narrative with some ideology such as jihadism. Individual 1 could reside in the Middle East and share relationships with people who hold similar beliefs, while individual 3 could live in a Western country and develop relationships online with individuals he or she likely would not have met otherwise. While law enforcement would view individual 3 as a lone wolf, they likely would not view themselves that way at all based upon the complex interactions of the relationships that form their own individual narrative. Now, the internet, with the advent of social media in particular, provides the perfect vehicle for the widest dissemination for terrorist narratives. Twitter in particular has been especially pervasive. Scholars who observe the study of the phenomenon note that there are tens of thousands of tweets daily, but one study shows that the majority of the tweets originate from between 500 and 2,000 distinct accounts, with many disseminated by autonomous bots. While the numbers of the tweets still pale in comparison to other political messages or even pop culture references, the social media posts by these groups are especially sensational and provide significant emotional appeal to those who individual narratives overlap with. Now, there's been much policy debate about whether or not the internet is responsible for radicalization. While the internet cannot be dismissed based upon its transformative nature over politics and social dynamics, radicalization occurred before the mass proliferation of the internet. Instead, humans use technology as a tool to advance their own goals, and the internet is merely an advancement of those tools, no different than the proliferation of the printing press. So, to figure out what to do next, we have to take a multi-pronged approach. Now, governments certainly must maintain a role in the information space due in no small part to their access to resources and reach. But any sound strategy will also require the inclusion of civil society institutions. This is because, in order to be effective, we must gain insight into local narratives that create the relationships around which radical ideologies can flourish. The top-down approach in the past is what fueled continued resentment and grievances, leading to the further spread of radicalization. Instead, long-term, bottom-up engagement by civil society, supported by national, regional, and local governments with local communities, must have a long-term approach to identifying the root cause of these grievances. Lastly, tech companies who provide the framework around which social media is built must be a recognized stakeholder in the anti-propaganda sphere. Most of the major tech corporations already possess individual countering hate speech initiatives, such as YouTube's Creators for Change and Facebook's P2P Challenging Extremism. But these organizations have little cohesive buy-in. Facebook's recent media attention regarding privacy breaches can also be problematic as well. And that leads us to a word of warning. So, if we take a look back, I think most people are probably familiar with the story of Cambridge Analytica. However, what a lot of people don't realize is that Cambridge Analytica originally started as a contractor working with the U.S. Department of Defense in order to combat terrorist narratives. They did this by profiling people's social media accounts and identifying a few key factors around which they could build a narrative to specifically target that individual rather than creating a broad blanket narrative. They were very successful with this and then reached out into the private sector and used these same tools and techniques through the use of political campaigns in order to apply targeted messages to individuals. So it represents a serious privacy consideration as we move forward in the future, knowing that this capability is out there and can be effective, but also has the ability to be misused as well. The other consideration that we have to bear in mind is limitations on freedom of speech. Obviously, these narratives represent a somewhat pernicious and dangerous sorts of communication, but at the same time, we also have to be mindful how attempting to counter them or through social media attempts to pull these posts offline represents a potential violation of freedom of speech. And then the final point I think is worth bringing out is in the past, it has been known that there have been numerous efforts to counter Islamist narratives. Notable ones were done by the Clarion Project. And on face value, they appear to be trying to counter those narratives in a polite and necessary way. But upon further review, those types of organizations are typically anti-Islam and attempt to promote an air of Islamophobia. So as we try to work with industry partners and civil society institutions, the U.S. government needs to be mindful of the partners that it develops in order to ensure that we are not promoting the values which may not be in line with our own. And so with that, I appreciate any questions you may have. Thank you. Now, Alistair Reid, who's an academic on the subject, views countering terrorist narratives as existing on a spectrum of response. And depending upon where that spectrum you lie will determine what type of tools you use. Now, on one end of the spectrum is strategic communication, which typically occurs by governments or nation states. Over the past several years, the concept of strategic communication has received significant academic and policy attention as a possible solution to countering the narratives used by terrorists. At its base level, strategic communication provides a diverse message in order to engage a wide audience. These types of messages typically come from governments in order to raise public awareness, forge relationships with key constituencies, and to correct misinformation. The U.S. State Department has invested heavily in the Global Engagement Center, which is charged with leading the U.S. government efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation from terrorist groups. The Global Engagement Center's primary countering mechanism is original content created by and distributed throughout the U.S. and international partners, which provide alternative viewpoints regarding terrorist narratives and ideas. The Global Engagement Center has partnered with the EU and other Arab nations, such as the United Arab Emirates, who have also adopted similar efforts. Now, one problematic area with government-sponsored strategic communication can be perceived paternalism. Grievances with Western involvement in Muslim affairs is a major driver of radicalism in the first place. So the presence of a Western view of Islam as a counter-narrative will likely be viewed negatively. Now, on the other end of the countering spectrum are counter-narratives themselves. And those typically originate through civil society organizations and seek to discredit and demystify violent extremist messages by challenging their ideology and logic. To be successful, counter-narratives need to mask their persuasive intent, which is why they must appear to come from a credible source. Counter-narratives fall prey to some of the same paternalistic limitations of strategic communications. Furthermore, counter-narratives assume the information space is far more linear than it actually is. Remembering back to our previous analysis that the passive reach of information does not lead to impact and action.